Hello, it is Creature, and while I do have a relatively spooky game to talk about, there is sadly nothing that I can talk about that will equal the abject horror that struck all of us, as a collective, when the cursed Pokemon lore dropped. Thanks, you Nakatsui, for puking the black bile that is the most abhorrent degeneracy onto a children's video game world. There is no joke here. I hope you're happy with yourself, you failed attempt at a human being. Darkest Dungeon is an eldritch turn-based roguelike that I've been playing for over a decade. I personally felt that it was a great pick for Halloween, since there aren't really any jump scares, and instead the game just utilizes its mechanics to put you in a state of constant unease while reminding you that
remind yourself that overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer.
Because more times than not, when you think you're in the clear,
the twisted faces of the damned, piled high and cloaked in malice.
in my opinion, a horror game that does not rely solely upon jump scares to scare the players, a hard divergence from the average horror slop that has been shoved down our throats since the days of is a good game. For a good frame of focus, think XCOM, but instead of facing down against Xenos from the stars, you are instead facing entities that are from beyond the stars and the colors of madness. This game introduced me to Cosmic Horror, and wears its inspiration proudly on its sleeves. Pretty much if you're a Lovecraft fan or just into that brand of horror, this is definitely the game for you. Now, some of you may be wondering, what is Cosmic Horror? And to explain it in simple terms, it is the revelation of that which has been unknown for eons. The awakening of some kind of deep primal fear that overcomes one when the ancient and unknowable horrors reveal themselves. It is the madness that one has when, well, to quote Lovecraft himself, with 5 feeble senses we pretend to comprehend the boundless complexities of the cosmos, and when those entities come knocking, only God can help us. The story of this game is pretty simple, and since there isn't really going to be any spoilers in this video, and since the game does so well explaining it, I'll just let the intro cinematic play.
Ruin has come to our family. You remember our venerable house? Opulent and imperial, gazing proudly from its stoic perch above the moor. I lived all my years in that ancient, rumor-shadowed manor, fattened by decadence and luxury. And yet I began to tire of conventional extravagance. Singular, unsettling tales suggested the mansion itself was a gateway to some fabulous and unnameable power. With relic and ritual, I bent every effort towards the excavation and recovery of those long-buried secrets, exhausting what remained of our family fortune on swarthy workmen and sturdy shovels. At last, in the salt-soaked crags beneath the lowest foundations, we unearthed that damnable portal antediluvian evil. Our every step unsettled the ancient earth, but we were in a realm of death and madness. In the end, I alone fled laughing and wailing through those blackened arcades of antiquity, until consciousness failed me. You remember our venerable house, opulent and imperial. It is a festering abomination. I beg you, return home, claim your birthright, and deliver our family from the ravenous, clutching shadows of the darkest dungeon.
So in short, yeah, the ancestor really fucked up and now we have to fix it. This game's art style is very unique. It's dark and cartoony, and I don't feel that anyone can confuse this game for another after you play it once. It really leads to the grim dark fantasy of the 15th century that this game was going for. and I have very little complaint. In fact, I remember doing art in high school, and after being challenged to come up with a unique style, I literally just copied Darkest Dungeon and drew Highwaymen. But in my opinion, the best part of this game is the soundtrack and the voice acting, namely the voice acting. I'm not saying they didn't knock it out of the park with the soundtrack, they did. However, I still have quotes from the Ancestor pop into my mind on a daily basis. Wayne June is the name behind the Ancestor, and the voice lines of the Ancestor have been the sole reason why I have decided to become more eloquent in my speech. The Ancestor/narrator does so much to add to the atmosphere of the game that I honestly do not think the game would be the same, or even half as memorable without it. And to top it off, this motherfucker even has a YouTube channel where he posts Darkest Dungeon memes.
Has come to our family. You remember our venerable house?
He's also done a bunch of audiobooks for a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stuff, or if you're just completely new to Cosmic Horror and have no idea about who H.P. Lovecraft is or what the fuck a Cthulhu is, I definitely recommend checking out some of his stuff. The music in this game is just as good, and has caused me to become way too overconfident in certain situations, because I felt the soundtrack wanted me to. Each area has its own track, and there isn't really an out-of-battle track. Instead, it's just kinda ambient sound with a string here and there. You can hear the wolves howling in the vault, things shuffling around in the silent runes, and unholy abominations scurrying in the warrens. Then BAM! Overall, I love it. There's even a different track, or should I say mix, of the battle themes depending on how far gone the light is. The darker the battle, the more intense the song is. I feel that Darkest Dungeon shows off just how much a good narrator and soundtrack can just bring a game to the next level. I don't think I really need to go any deeper into this. It's good art, good sound, me happy. The gameplay is pretty simple, but absolutely brutal. The game even warns you whenever you first load up the game that, yes, you will die, you will lose, and you're probably gonna need a restart. The game can be split up into two parts, the Hamlet and the dungeons. I'll talk about all the DLC stuff later. For right now, let's just focus on the Hamlet. The Hamlet is your home base and is the town nearest to the family manor. Here is where you will be doing all of your planning and prep work before you enter the dungeons. It's similar to the Avenger from XCOM 2. You know, the last good XCOM game. You ain't safe, Chimera Squad. I'm coming back for round 2, motherfucker. Most of the buildings will be unlocked whenever you first start off the game, but after your first few weeks, you should have everything unlocked. A week in this game is just a signifier of how many missions you've done. There are different lengths of missions, but each of them only takes a week. Each week, items in the Nomad Wagon will restock, new heroes will arrive in the stagecoach, and you'll get a town event. This can be anything from free recruits, good effects, or bad effects that can hurt your roster or your next mission. The more you play, the crazier the events get. A week is also how long you should have to wait for your treatments to work, which more times than not ends up taking at least 2 or maybe even 3 weeks because my shield breaker went on a vision quest to find God after downing an unholy amount of hallucinogens. I just wanted to specify by what I meant by week, since at one point I asked ChatGPT for a good week-by-week strategy for Darkest Dungeon. It gave me a 30-day IRL challenge run where I was somehow expected to have a champion level character by the 4th in-game week. The buildings in the Hamlet can be upgraded with loot that you get from dungeons called heirlooms. Heirlooms are your main building upgrade resource, therefore they are extremely valuable. The first building that you get is the stagecoach, and this is where you're going to be getting your recruits. and trust me, you're gonna be going through a lot of them. I usually try and upgrade my stagecoach right out of the gate so that I can get 4 recruits a week instead of 2. This can be done because heirlooms can be exchanged for one another, and the game starts you off with enough to where you should be able to exchange everything into deeds and crests so that you can upgrade your stagecoach. Then we have the Nomad Wagon, which allows you to buy trinkets to buff your characters, and get some more esoteric items as well. The Smithy and Guild is where you're going to be upgrading your troops. The Smithy is for better weapons and armor, and the Guild is for improving your attacks. Next is the Sanatorium. Here you can cure your characters of diseases, as well as subject them to horrific psychological torture in order to cure them of certain negative mental afflictions. After that, we have the Tavern and the Abbey for blowing off stress either through worldly or spiritual means, and yes, stress is a massive mechanic in this game, but we'll talk about that later. Lastly, in the Hamlet, we have the Survivalist and the Districts. The Survivalist just allows you to upgrade your camping skills, and the Districts are hefty investments to your town, but they give you some amazing buffs. There are 18 heroes and classes in total, with 2 of them being DLC. These will be your main people. You'll get a random assortment of classes each week in your stagecoach, so there isn't too much to worry about if a few of them die. Just don't have an entire party die or you're going to have a very hard time. Having an upgraded smithy and guilds allows you to somewhat respec your new recruits to whatever you want. For instance, I tend to use my Vestals as backline healing units, and since each class has 7 attack/skills, and only 4 of them are unlocked at the start, a Vestal with Mace Bash, Divine Comfort, Illumination, and Hand of Light is pretty fucking useless for my purposes. So it's a good idea to make sure you know what skills they have and decide if you want to drop the coinage to make them viable for whatever purposes you have. At the start of the game, they're all going to be level 0, but you can upgrade your wagon after getting some upgrades to your guild and smithy to have them spawn in at level 1 to 3. The only 2 of these characters that matter is Dismas and Rainyald. We keep those boys safe. Each class has its own use, so in no particular order, Crusaders are what Rainyald is, and is going to be your generic frontline dude. He's going to be your standard beat stick, but he does have some healing capabilities. He's more of a generalist beat stick and can buff as well. Holy Lance is really good for getting out of party mix-ups, and Smite feels really cool whenever it lands. Lepers are just beat sticks, plain and simple. They can buff and heal themselves, but for the most part, they're just murder machines. Plague Doctors are backline support units. They specialize in stacking blight damage and can be used to heal/cure damage over time effects, and can give very powerful buffs to the beat sticks. Highwaymen are midline damage dealers. They have a useful AoE attack for dealing with chaff enemies. They can also be very useful for dealing with backline units since they do have a very powerful range shot, and they do have skills for realigning themselves if there's a party mix-up. Jesters can also be used as midline support units for bleeding stacks. You can utilize their party ballad to give out group buffs, as well as inspiring tune to cure stress. It should also be noted that he is one of the few stress relief characters in the game. He can also be geared to utilize the Finale ability, which synergizes with his other attacks, and the Solo ability to deal out a massive amount of damage to all the enemies. Musketeers and Arbalists are literally the same unit, with one technically being DLC, but it's free, so whatever. They are backline damage dealers, pure and simple. They have some support abilities and some healing capabilities, but for the most part, they're just going to be backline damage dealers. Gravediggers are midline ranged damage dealers. They predominantly target enemies in the midline and can be used to put out some blight damage and self-heal damage over time effects. Houndmasters can fit into almost any slot and mainly deal with AoE attacks, debuffs, and bleed stacking. He does have some self-heal and buff abilities, but he's better used as a pure damage dealer. Abominations are useful because they can use all of their skills, the downside being that they turn into, you guessed it, an abomination. They're good for killing things, but will stress out your entire party, and they tend to lose a lot of their own stress quickly. Antiquarians are your main income earners. They aren't really great for combat, but they do have lots of buffs. That's pretty much what they are, just a backline buffer. However, their real use is in finding treasure. They have the ability to find unique items that have a very high stat count and can increase the stat count for all of your other stuff as well. To fully utilize this, you just have to select her and then open up up whatever curio you came across. Bounty hunters are the hammer in the hammer and anvil analogy. They utilize the marked system and are able to mark enemies as well. While they aren't strong on their own, they do get a lot of buffs against enemies that are stunned and marked, and they do act as the combo king when it comes to finishing off enemies. Hellions are literally just frontline beatsticks, but feminist. Men-at-Arms are kinda odd, to be honest. They can either be frontline beatsticks or a backline support unit. They are pretty useful to have in a roster and are extremely versatile. Occultists are backline debuffs and can be really good healers or the most trash healers you've ever seen. Their skill, Weird Reconstruction, can insta-heal an ally or do nothing to them besides give them bleed damage. If you're gonna bring them as a healer, just make sure you bring a Plague Doctor. Lastly, Vestals. Vestals can be geared to either be backline healers, dealing out damage when possible, or as midline support units. But I found them used best as healers. For the DLC classes, there is the Flagellant, a pure and unadulterated damage sponge. They specialize in putting out bleed damage and giving himself bleed damage. He can be used to take status from other party members, give other party members regeneration. His main mechanic is his special abilities that can be activated after his health falls below 40%, which can either be used to heal himself up, deal a lot of bleed damage, and just deal a ton of damage. Effectively, this character punishes the enemies for the more damage he receives. Shield breakers are, you guessed it, amazing beat sticks with armor penetration. They also have access to moves that gives them Aegis, which allows them to negate damage entirely. However, they will still get status effects. Your heroes will inevitably gain status traits. Those can either be really good or really bad. You can get traits either after missions or randomly during missions. Some of the curios you find in a mission can either give good ones, give bad ones, be completely random, or remove good or bad ones. Not all of the traits are bad. There are a lot of good ones like eating less food, better health, or death blow resistance. Also, I just realized I forgot to mention that this game has permadeath, so whenever your characters die, they just stay dead. In this game, whenever a character falls below 0 health, they don't die. Instead, they are now on death's doorstep. From here, every single tick of damage has a chance to outright kill them. However, if they are healed, then they will no longer be on death's doorstep, but they will still have a decent amount of debuffs. Some of the effects, traits, / afflictions can be removed in the sanitarium. However, it usually costs a lot of money and a week or two to do so. Once you get your party set up, you can hit the Embark tab. From here, you'll be given an overview of all the different areas and all of the different missions available this week. Each week, a new set of missions will spawn. These can be anything from exploration, cleansing the area of enemies, or purifying relics. You'll also be building your party from here, so just make sure you put each character in the appropriate slot. When you hit the Provisions tab, you're able to take supplies with you and other items that can be helpful with getting more loot or healing characters. Some items are more useful in specific dungeons, like herbs and holy water, and others, like the skeleton key and shovel, should always be taken. Food, shovels, and torches are your basic supplies. On a short mission, I'll usually bring 8 food and 6 torches, 8 torches if it's a newer party. The food can be used to heal a little bit of health, and there is usually a hunger pop-up where you're going to be required to have 1 food per character in your party. The torches keep the light going. There are different light levels, from radiant, dim, shadowy, dark, and then black as pitch. For simplicity's sake, the brighter the torches, the better your guys fight. The darker it is, the more debuffs they'll have, and the more stress they'll get. The monsters will hit harder, but there is a better chance of finding good loot. Which, I mean, kinda makes sense. If I'm crawling around the sewers infested with swine people and it's pitch black, yeah, I'm gonna be a little bit nervous, to say the least. Stress is a big mechanic, and throughout the missions, your heroes are going to be facing off against some of the most horrific abominations and monsters that are straight out of Lovecraft's works. And that might cause a few psychological issues. The more stressed they are, the more likely they are to break, and when the stress meter hits max, they snap. From here, they can either gain an affliction or become virtuous. This means either becoming a massive fucking problem or a massive asset. But naturally, the more powerful your characters get, the more jaded they get to the whole monstrosities beyond comprehension thing. Each one of the dungeons is different, so you'll need to bring specific heroes for each areas. For instance, a lot of enemies in the ruins can't be hit with bleed damage but are very weak to blight damage. so a jester is not going to do well. Once you get into the dungeon, your characters will then just have to kind of go through the rooms and hallways to either explore 90%, deal with 100% of the room battles, or purify all the relics. And while you're in the dungeon, you will have a lot of different fights and stumble across different curios. These curios can, like I said earlier, give you good things or bad things. The best thing to do is, if you don't know what a curio does, just look online. Whenever you access a curio, you'll also see a little slot where you can drop an item to increase the rewards from the curio. However, I'd recommend paying attention to what you do, lest you fuck up royally. The main horror of this game can be felt mainly in the dungeons. While at the start, whenever your characters have full HP and full stress, you're not going to be feeling it. However, whenever you're getting done with a long mission and most of your characters are beaten and bloodied, some of them being at death's door 3 times this mission, you start to feel it. Because eventually, your heals start to run out, the enemies become more ferocious, and it starts to become unclear on whether or not you're actually going to finish this mission. However, the game does give you a way out, not like that. There is a retreat button from combat, however it isn't 100% effective, and you can leave the dungeon at any time, so if you lose a few characters during a mission, just try to get out of the battle and get the hell out of the dungeon with whatever loot you were able to scrounge up. The 4 dungeons in the base game are the Ruins, which is going to be your first area, where you'll be fighting skeletons, spiders, and cultists. It's a good idea to bring blight dealers, since bleed is pretty much useless, and since the Ruins are where a lot of quote-unquote nice things are, I'd recommend bringing skeleton keys and holy water. Also, herbs are useful since you might run into an alchemy table. The Vault is where you're going to want to bring a lot of bleeding damage. Blight isn't too useful here, but it's not as useless here as bleed is in the Ruins. I'd recommend bringing a plague doctor since most of the things here deal blight damage. Also, bring along bandages, anti-venom, and herbs. The Warrens suck. A lot of enemies here have protection and are resistant to blight, so bring bleed damage and armor penetrating heroes like the Grave Robber and the Shield Breaker. Just like in the Vault, bring anti-venom and a good amount of herbs and an extra shovel and some bandages. It's also useful to, again, bring a Plague Doctor since they can heal a lot of the damage over time stuff. The Cove is where you want to bring a good amount of medical herbs and 2 extra shovels and some holy water. Enemies here have high protection and have high resistance to bleed, so bring AP and Blight. Mini-bosses can spawn anywhere at any time. These are the Collector, the Shambler, and for the DLC ones, that is the Fanatic and the Thing from the Stars. There are special conditions that have to be met for the mini-bosses to spawn, like having a lot of loot for the Collector, light being at 0 for the Shambler, and actually the Shambler's altar. You can activate it with a torch if you really want to lose your party. The Zealot will announce himself in town and then show up if 2 or more of your party are inflicted with the Crimson Curse, and the game is going to straight up warn you when Starboy is around. Each area has 2 specific bosses that you'll need to kill 3 times each for each different difficulty level. The DLC stuff is a little bit different, so I'll talk about that later. Each of the bosses can be taken down in a lot of different ways. For instance, the Necromancer is kind of a pushover, and you can pretty much take whatever heroes you want as long as you can take care of the ads quickly. But for bosses like the Hag, you're going to need to bring some backline baddies since you won't be able to beat the shit out of her with your beat sticks. And if you try to bring the quote-unquote usual suspects to that fight, you won't stand a chance. And finally, we have the Darkest Dungeon. You can go into it from week 1 and don't need to actually unlock it. However, it is the final dungeon of the game, and it's where the Lovecraftian stuff gets ramped up to 100. And since this game has so very little to actually spoil, and since I know the knowledge of what lies within the Darkest Dungeon will be maddening, I'm not gonna tell you shit about it. For the DLC, we have the Crimson Court, which adds in an entire vampiric aspect into Darkest Dungeon. So naturally, your characters can become inflicted with the Crimson Curse, which means effectively that they are vampires now. They'll need to consume the blood, which is a resource you will be coming across every now and then in the dungeons, and as stated earlier, there will be an increased chance of the Fanatic showing up. However, they're not really going to be encountering anything from the Crimson Court until you do the very first mission of the DLC. From there, Crimson Court enemies have a chance to spawn in normal dungeons, similarly to cultists and whatnot. Next up is going to be the Farmstead from the Colors of Madness DLC. This is going to be your main wave-based survival area, where you're going to need to fight and survive in order to collect comet shards, which can be used either as an exchange currency for heirlooms, or they can be traded to the Nomad Wagon for a bunch of different, very powerful trinkets. There are mainly 3 repeatable quests, that being the Babby introduction area, the veteran boss kill mission, and then at the highest difficulty in endless mode. Lastly, we have the Butcher's Circus, and this is going to be the PvP part of the game. It doesn't affect your progression and is just a place to go if you want to go one-to-one with other players. All the heroes here are maxed out and have access to circus trinkets that you can earn by playing games in the circus. From my experience, it's kind of similar to Hearthstone, where the games kind of boil down to whoever has the better gimmick. So if you're able to figure out some wacky party compositions or just want to get some ideas from other players, this is the place to go. And to be completely honest, I tend not to mess with the circus too much and just kind of focus on the main game. Now, for the negatives of this game, one of the biggest complaints that I've heard is that it's too RNG based and it's too difficult. To that, I say, get good. I mean, no shit, it's RNG based. I mean, in fact, I'd argue that that's part of the experience. The game straight up warns you at the beginning when you boot it up that, yeah, you're gonna get your dick flattened. And it tells you how likely you are to hit in combat. XCOM is the closest series that I can think of to Darkest Dungeon, and if you've ever played XCOM, then you should know damn well a 95% chance to hit still leaves you with a 5% chance not to. And if you roll a nat 1 on that virtual D20, you're fucked. Another example is Baldur's Gate. You know what, fuck it. In fact, every single tabletop game from D&D, Pathfinder to fucking Warhammer. You know what, screw it. Every single JRPG to come out, and that includes Pokemon. All of these games have chance-based combat. It's all on dice rolls, whether real or virtual. I think the problem here that people have with the game is that it just does not let you save scum. I have a feeling that the same people who have an issue with Darkest Dungeon for being too based on RNG are the exact same people who throw on karmic dice in Baldur's Gate and then save scum before every fucking roll interaction because they cannot fathom that there's the possibility that you may get fucked over by RNG and have a roll attempt fail. I'm sorry, if you're looking for a hand-holding game, Darkest Dungeon is not it. Darkest Dungeon will not hold your hand. This is not one of those types of games where you can just kind of create whatever character you want and then save scum to the point where you will just automatically pass every single interaction. It's just down to the amount of saves you're willing to do. Darkest Dungeon just doesn't play that shit. If you play like an idiot, then you're not going to have a good time. The game will demand that you learn how to utilize your characters correctly, know how to make the safest moves, know when to cut your losses, and know that yes, just sometimes luck is not in your favor and you're gonna get fucked over. So again, I say to all those people that don't like it because it's quote-unquote too hard, get good. Darkest Dungeon is an unabashedly brutal game that is extremely difficult at times, but despite that, you can still overcome it. In fact, that's the entire point of the game. Despite the fact that there are evils and demons and monsters from beyond our comprehension, we still hold within us the ability to overcome these monsters. All you need to do is just a good bit of planning, some good plays here and there, and have some contingencies for whenever your plan inevitably fails. It is a game that, even now, with being over a decade old, still farms salt like it's 2015, and because of that, I give it a 10 out of 10. I have played this game forever, and I will continue playing it until I die. I love this game, not only for being a truly horrific game based on how the game runs itself, with every single move feeling like a gamble, but also introducing me to a whole new side of fantasy and horror that I have never heard of before. While I know this game isn't for everybody, it is still one of my favorite games of all time, if not my favorite. And because of that, I can't give it anything less than a 10 out of 10. I highly recommend you buy it, play it, and get slaughtered. Anyway, happy Halloween. I hope everybody has a good amount of fun out there and drive safe. Anyway, thanks for sticking around this long. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you. And yeah, I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.
And I know for sure that without meant to be. If your heart is locked there, I may have a key. Could you please be mine? Hey, you trapped my soul, you broke my law. I think you're safe, cause you